Hello adventurers, my name is Chance, so welcome to my Spellbook, and thank you so much for taking a look at the 6th episode of our Elf Subrace series. Today we're going to be going over one of the more popular subraces, at least at the beginning of 5e, and that was the High Elf, which was released in the Player's Handbook. The High Elf was the most common choice, at least at the beginning of 5e, for elf mains that wanted to be a good character, more specifically a lawful good character. You have to bear in mind, of course, when the Player's Handbook was released, it only had the High Elf, the Wood Elf, and the Drow, and naturally the Drow being good, although it can happen, it's not super likely. And the Wood Elf are more chaotic than lawful, so that's where the High Elf saw its surge in popularity, although these days it's been replaced by a couple of the other elven subraces. That being said, it still does have a place, there are some advantages to going with it, and if you're a rules-light person and you want to keep things as simple as possible, the High Elf is a pretty damn good way to go about it. In any case, before we dive into its traits here, just want to mention, please check out the full playlist. You're going to want to watch at the very least the elf video, just so you are aware of all the features you get. And you can do so by clicking on that little eye icon up top there, or waiting until the end of the video and clicking on the relevant end screen. In any case, let's now dive right into the High Elf's traits. In relation to your ability score improvement, you gain a +1 to intelligence. You also gain an extra language of your choice, so speak, read, and write an extra language. And you gain a cantrip of your choice from the wizard spell list, and intelligence is your spellcasting modifier for it. And you gain elf weapon training, which gives you proficiency with the longsword, short bow, and long bow. Needless to say, the classes that gain the most from this are usually the spellcasters, namely the wizard in particular. Reason being, +1 to intelligence, super nice. You get an extra cantrip, and since it uses intelligence as its spellcasting modifier, it's going to scale with the rest of your cantrips, which is super nice. And elf weapon training gives you something to fall back on in case you're in a zone of silence or an anti-magic field, something of that nature. Overall, though, outside of spellcasters, it's a little bit hard to place this subrace with any class in particular. Reason being is it does everything okay, like it gives you a little bit of magic through the cantrip, it gives you a little bit of extra utility through the extra language, and gives you a little bit of extra martial prowess through elf weapon training. There's always a little bit of a debate over which cantrip you should go with regards to any time you can gain one, whether or not it's through Magic Initiate or through subraces such as this. Most people tend to go with Prestidigitation, although I think it really does depend on what kind of a character you're playing. There are plenty of good damaging cantrips. Toll of the Dead and Eldritch Blast are pretty good examples. However, there are some more utility cantrips as well, things that pertain to Minor Illusion, for example, as well as more recent releases that help you with combat control, Sapping Sting being the obvious choice. If you're curious about all those, just check out the cantrip playlist, which I will likely be redoing at some point in the future, so keep an eye out for that. I'll more than likely do that more so behind the scenes, however, so I don't know. I'm kind of still just playing around with the idea of it. In any case, there's a ton of good cantrips to pick that will give your character a decent amount of flavor. However, there is a fairly obvious drawback if you're going to be going with a cantrip that calls for a saving throw or requires you to make a spell attack. And that is, unless you're going to be investing into your intelligence, there is going to be a point of diminishing returns where the effectiveness of your cantrip starts to diminish just really significantly. This will usually happen towards the end of the early game or the start of the mid game, and that's when creatures will just start making those saves without really putting in too much effort. They could always roll poorly, I suppose, but The odds won't be in your favor as much as they were during those first couple levels, and of course you are likely to miss as well if you're required to make spell attacks. That being said, all is for naught. Some spells piggyback off of weapon attacks, right? Booming Blade is a pretty good example of that, as is Green Flame Blade, so those are pretty obvious choices if you're playing a martial class. However, taking a step back away from the cantrip you get and looking at the traits as a whole, they're honestly pretty good. It might be overbalanced to a point of redundancy in some cases, but as a nice, easy, simple to use character where you don't really have to keep track of anything, like special abilities you can only use once per standard duration of time, this is pretty much for you. It's up your alley. And to be fair, a lot of the Player's Handbook races were meant to be really easy. The High Elf is probably the best example for the Elf, as the Wood Elf and the Drow are fairly complicated in their own rights, and there are some things that are worth considering. But if you'd like a nice, easy Elf and you'd like to be good, the High Elf should be fine for you. Now let's get to my personal thoughts on it. Overall, the High Elf is, I don't know, I want to say too balanced. It doesn't so much lend itself to an obvious playstyle. That being said, it's not terrible, like it won't hurt you if you take it, but I feel like unless you're playing a heavily restricted game, there are just better options. The Shadow Marked Elf in particular is super good, and almost every elf outside of that lends itself to such an obvious playstyle that it's honestly just a little bit more fun to play. The High Elf is really good if you're new to 5e, and it's really good if you're trying to get a feel for the rules and you don't want to worry about resource management to a point of being overwhelmed. But if you're a comfortable player, then it's kind of hard for me to justify picking this. It is one of the only elven subraces to currently exist that have you pick intelligence, so if you're a wizard and you're playing in a one-shot and you want to give yourself just that extra nudge, then I suppose it can be quite good for that, but as you level up in most campaigns, this +1 is going to be less and less important. So, I don't know, it is really interesting. I'm sure a lot of us have a lot of nostalgia related to the High Elf. I know I do. It was one of the first characters I ever played. I played a High Elf rogue. I never really got off the ground, sadly. That was when I first started playing in Adventures League, so I just cycled through a lot of character concepts really quick. But I do have fond memories of the High Elf, and it's still played relatively frequently, if for no other reason than its flavor of kind of being a proper elf, for lack of a better term. Really simple and really nice in terms of role-playing, but in terms of mechanics, once again, it kind of falls up short, especially as you get to those higher levels. In any case, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I overlooked something important. If you think so, let me know down beneath in the comment section. Be sure to mention any thoughts, questions, comments, or concerns you have regarding the High Elf, and any cool stories or builds you've done in the past as well, or that you'd like to do. If you'd like to get access to a free one-shot as well, feel free to go over to the guild hall and use code WELCOME to get yours. And as always, guys, I hope you have a wonderful day, and of course, happy adventuring.